Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mind of Miz podcast. I'm your host, Ms. Rivera. So this week, me and my wife experienced an earthquake. Apparently, those happened here in Dallas, and it was a tiny little quake. I think it was like 3.0, 3.2 on the scale, and it was interesting. We were out at lunch, late lunch, and right as we were wrapping up, we we heard a sound at first. It was kind of strange because we heard this kind of loud boom sound, and then we felt the floor tremble, and our table shook where we were sitting. I could feel the floor shaking under my feet for just a couple seconds. Right, it wasn't too long. And it was interesting. We didn't know what it was at first. Had no idea. All we knew was that we looked at each other. We got real quiet, and and we looked at each other, and we were like, "Well, it's probably time to leave." We were in a tunnel. They have these tunnels here in Dallas, and there's restaurants and that kind of stuff down there. And so we were having, we were eating lunch in a basement under some probably 50-story building above us. So we decided that it was probably best for us to scatter, and we promptly walked outside and just wondering what that was. It wasn't until like at midnight, I think I finally got around to trying to figure out what had happened, and browsing the internet, trying to find to see if anybody else had felt what we felt. And sure enough, there was a tremor. So a bit of an earthquake here in Dallas. So everything's good. Nothing's crazy, but that was interesting. It was my first time ever experiencing something like that. And well, today we're gonna be looking at Job, chapter 3, and we're gonna be looking at verses 10 through 19. And it kind of is a good segue talking about earthquakes into what we're going to talk about today, because obviously Job got a earth shattering news for him when he got all the news that he had. But it made me think about natural disasters, and there's all kinds of natural disasters. We lived in Florida. And in Florida, it was known for hurricanes. So you would get hurricanes coming through, and causing a lot of issues there. We've lived in Chicago, where you get blizzards. We've lived in Arkansas, and we experienced our share of little tornadoes and tornado warnings, and alarms going off, and so it kind of got me thinking about all of these disasters, and what people do normally in disasters is that they kind of shut it down. They find a place to hide. They find a place to get away from it all, and they just really forget about the world, as it were, and focus on themselves. I gotta save myself. I gotta go find a place where I'm gonna be safe. And what's interesting about that is that that's precisely what Job is starting to do here in chapter 3. And so I want to title today's lesson in Job chapter 3, "Forgetting Heaven." Forgetting heaven. Because in the midst of everything that Job says, he forgets heaven. He forgets the one gift that God has given us so that we can have hope. And so we're going to try to unpack some of this today. There's so much to be said. I have a multitude of notes here that I've compiled, and I'm gonna set them aside way over here, And I'm going to ignore them, and I'm going to have just one little sheet of paper in front of me. And because the problem sometimes is, sorry about that, guys. I know you probably heard that. I should have muted my mic there. The problem, however, is that, sometimes when I have my notes out, I tend to try to want to explain everything that's in my notes, and then I end up not covering, at least generally, everything that we're talking about here. And so we want to make sure that we accomplish that. I want to say thank you to those of you that are on our live session, to our subscribers that are going to be part here of our live session that we have with the Q&A, and then those that are watching us on X as well. Thank you. If there's anyone there, thank you so much for watching and being a part of this. Let's really quickly then jump right into this. If I can get my timer up, that'd be awesome. Let's go to Job chapter 3, let's start at verse 10. Now, we did cover verse 10 last week, but we only covered it briefly. And really, the end of verse 10 is a great starting point for the rest of the chapter here, because we're going to be talking about troubles and how troubles lead us to forgetting about heaven. And the big lesson here really is going to be ultimately trusting God when we're going through the suffering, okay? So chapter 3, starting at verse 10, because it did not shut the opening of my mother's womb. I'll remind you there, he was talking to the night, okay? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, please refer back to the last lesson. Or hide trouble from my eyes, okay? So this theme of trouble now is going to underlie the rest of what we're talking about. So I want you to pay attention to that word, trouble, and you'll kind of see how, because trouble comes, how he begins to speak in a less than wise way, Job here, okay? Let's look at verse 11. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, and why did the breast that I should suck? For now I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept then. I would have been at rest with kings and with counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who were filling their houses with silver, or like a miscarriage which is discarded. I would not be, as infants that never saw light. There the wicked cease from raging, and there the weary are at rest. The prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. And we thank the Lord for the reading of his word. It is quite the truth among humanity, amongst us men and women that exist in the world, that suffering touches us all. It doesn't matter your stature, it doesn't matter how much money you have, it doesn't matter how good you are. We see here in Job a blameless man, a righteous man, a man who really God looked at him and said, that's as blameless as you can get as a human. There's not much we could say about him in the regard of his piety towards myself. This would be God speaking, right? And he was rich. He was blessed beyond his imagination. And what we understand and we come to understand from Job is something very interesting, in that even though he has this idyllic lifestyle, we talked about that in chapter 1, he still suffers. And so by this point, he's been suffering at least a week or two, but potentially for months now. And in that short span, he has gotten a new flavor of life. He has gotten to taste something that he's never tasted before. And the problem with this is it's that for him, it's messing with his worldview to some extent. It's making him ask questions, and in chapter 3, it's making him speak in such a way that would make him sound almost as if he were an unbeliever, though he is not, obviously, an unbeliever. We know that when his wife tells him, curse God and die, he tells her, you speak as one of the foolish women, never calls her a foolish woman herself, but she was speaking as a foolish woman. Well, we can in some ways say, well, you speak as an unbeliever here, Job. But here's the problem. Job was the most blameless man. And so whatever's true about Job and his frustrations and the way that he's using language now, talking about death and wishing death to be a part of his life and all these things that we're going to be looking at, the same is true for us, but 10 times over. We would do 10 times worse of what Job has done here. And I think we have to make sure that we don't pretend otherwise. There's a reason why the Bible states about Job the things that it does. It's not to demonstrate to us that Job is somehow superior than a human, but that he is a man who fears God for nothing, who serves God for nothing in return. And that we are very far away from being that. And if Job can encounter the suffering and act and respond in the way that he's responding now in chapter 3, what does that say about us? And so I think it's important for us to take some time as we're looking through the book of Job to really reflect upon our own sins and upon our own misgivings and our own lack of value and our own lack of piety towards God and the things of God. We have, said this before, and we've heard this from other preachers. It's easy for us to ask God, why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? And yet when he says simply do this, we don't do the simple things he asks us to do. We don't go to the word. We don't go to church. We don't do the simple things that God would require us to do and ask of us to do. Yet we want him to answer these life altering questions. We want God to tell us mysteries that he himself has decided he won't tell us. The hidden things are from the Lord, and those that he reveals to us are for us to know. And this is something that's really hard for mankind, you and I, to accept, because we want, at the end of the day, we want what we want. And so what happens here with Job, as we now try to look at these verses, is a complete disregard for what we know is actually true. A complete disregard for the first thing I would say is heaven. And this is why I want to, title this teaching, Forgetting Heaven. Well, how do you forget about heaven? Well, let me ask you a question. When was the last time that you actually thought about heaven? When was the last time that you spent any significant amount of time pondering what heaven is like? When was the last time that you sat in prayer or meditation and you perhaps went through the Bible to find passages of the hope that we have to be with our Father God face to face with our Maker? How often and when was the last time that you thought about these things? And if we're honest and we can give an honest answer, then we might be able to understand why Job forgets about heaven, why Job forgets about the good things that God has done for him. You see, what we find in chapters 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Job is Job acknowledging that God has blessed him. But what we find in chapter 3 is a man unwilling to see the value of what that is. That is, he doesn't appreciate the blessing. He knows it's a blessing, but he cannot appreciate it. That's a difficult place to be in. You know, if you're going through trouble in your life and someone came to you and said, hey, you know, Mr. or Mrs., look what God has given you. You have your health still. You have your children still. Let's say you're going through, you lost your job. Let's just say that. You know, and you're being told you still have your husband, you still have your wife, you still have your children. You know, God has provided so that you have at least a severance package, you know, to get along with. You still have food in your refrigerator. You still have a roof over your head. You still have your friends. You still have your church. And you would say, yeah, I acknowledge all of that, but I'm going to stay mad about this. That's not appreciating the things that we do have. And so every once in a while, I'll sit in my home here and I'll look around and I'll just look at all the things that I have. And I'll stand up and I'll walk around my home and just see everything, look at everything. I'll look at my wife. She doesn't know I'm doing it, but I'll look at her and I'll think about her. And then I think about my friends, and I purposely try to think of all the good things that God does until I think about them, until I reach a point where I exalt the Lord. And it brings me to a worship, recognizing and appreciating what I do have. But you can ask my wife, there's plenty of times in my life where I am melancholy, I'm sulking, I am angry, I am displeased, I am at my wit's end because this or that has happened, and I don't take a moment to take in and appreciate what God has already done and continues to do as a God of providence as he is. And so what we see in the transition of the life of Job is something that we should really pay close attention to. Because what we don't want to do as believers is use the gift of speech that God has given us, as we learned last week, to praise his holy name, to find those things with which we can look around and say, the Lord has blessed me with such and such. And that we use our speech in such a way that we worship God. That we don't do that and instead curse the day of our birth. And instead go into a form of speech that allows you to forget heaven, to not trust God. Until ultimately, if you were to accept these things, and this is where a lot of Christians have lost their way, or those that have proclaimed Christianity, because not only have they spoken these things negatively, because they haven't seen the hand of God work the way they would want it to work, and they then believe it, and they embrace it, and they put it on as a cloak, and they live it, and before you know it, they leave God. They curse God, and they die. And so it's important for us as believers to maintain a fidelity in our piety towards God. It's important for us to maintain actively reminding ourselves daily of the good things that God does for us, that we don't fall into speech like what Job is saying here. And in fact, the entire book of Job, as we come to the end of it and God speaks, is a demonstration of the very mercy of God. Because what happens is this: when men and women try to find the why, the answer to the why. Why is this happening to me? Why am I suffering? Why can't I get ahead in life? Why is this going on? What we do is we don't ask the question and wait there for an answer. We go seek the answer. We go try to find it. And some do it through alcohol, others through pornography, others through drugs, others through gossiping, others through trying to make money, others by defrauding others. There's a million different ways, and we try to find the why. And here we have Job, who can't do much in the form of action because God has him upon a hill, upon an ash heap, scarred and in pain. God has brought the wrath of him. He cannot search as he would, but he's using what he has, and he's using his language. Here's the mercy of God in the book of Job. God answers Job. And when God answers Job, it's very interesting what happens. And many, many, many months down the line, we'll probably look at this again, but I want you to get this. When God answers Job, Job essentially stays silent. When God answers you, he interrupts your speech pattern that is about to blaspheme him. That is important to recognize. We have Job wishing that he was dead, wishing that he was stillborn, wishing that he would just die now. He's speaking as if death was the end all be all. He speaks here almost like an atheist speaks. When you die, you just die. Everything just stops. It's not that Job believes this deep in his heart. It's that he's been blinded by the suffering. And he speaks now as an unbeliever. And he says things that are true in some ways. And there's much that we can glean. But is not God merciful that eventually he speaks to Job and makes him be quiet? Because Job was speaking of things that he knew nothing of. Well, that's the introduction. We have a lot of time still. I want to get into some of these verses, and I want you to follow with me carefully because, yes, a lot of the language here is going to be, it's poetry, and poetry is always difficult to understand. I got a lot of books, not a lot, I would say probably a good handful of books that consist of poetry. I've never been someone who was into poetry. I always found it kind of boring for whatever reason. But poetry is something you have to work. And maybe that's just a descriptor of some of my laziness, right? Because you gotta work into reading. And one of the things that you'll find in Job is that you have to read it and reread it and read it and reread it, research, search, study, read it, pray, read it again, because it's not so straightforward, okay? And so I don't pretend that at the end of each of these lessons, you're like, aha, I got it, I'm good, No, I'm hoping that this is just opening your appetite to really go read it for yourself. And hopefully you've already done that. You're doing that along with me because this is a journey I hope we're taking together. But let's go to the text, verse 11. And first of all, end of verse 10, so 10b, where it says, or hide trouble from my eyes. The trouble. That's the language that he is going to use here throughout Job, okay? Trouble. This is what he's referring to, okay? And it's all the suffering that has happened on him. And look how he talks about it here. Why did I not die at birth? Okay, so we got verses 11 and 12 are going to be about death at birth, dying. But look how he puts it. He says, why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb, and expire? So here, he's referring specifically to being born and then dying. Okay? Not being stillborn. We're not there yet. So this is a little bit different than the few verses down. You'll see that here in a few minutes. Well, why is he saying this? Well, we know from chapter 1, he wanted the very day of his conception to be in darkness. He wanted the very, actions that brought about his conception to not even occur. He wanted that night to be so dark and so deadly that he couldn't possibly ever have been born. Well, he recognizes by the time he gets to verse 10 here and now verse 11, well, that's futile. And we talked about that. It was a futile wish. It was never going to pass. It was never going to happen. And so now he moves on. Well, what's the next best thing? Well, if a conception occurs, well, then, and I'm born, well, maybe I just die. Maybe I just die right after I'm born. And this is what he's saying. Now, what is he implying here? Well, we know that he's already said just a chapter ago that, actually, let's read it. Chapter 1, verse 20, where it says, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshiped. He said, this is what he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. This is verse 21. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So he recognizes God's blessing. Again, this is the acknowledgement part that we were talking about just earlier. He acknowledges the blessing, but now in verse 11, he says, I'd rather not have it. I'd rather have just died at birth. Well, that's remarkable. Because the Christian is called, and not just the Christian, if we look at the Old Testament, are they not called as a people consistently to remember what God has done? To build here, to build there, to put this here, to put that there as a reminder of what God has done. Well, for us as Christians, we have to remind ourselves so that we don't fall into the kind of speech pattern that Job, here now falls into. Poor Paul, I just mentioned Paul didn't do that. Paul teaches us, in chapter 5 of Romans, actually, the opposite. He says we have a hope that leads to worship. And that hope that we have is of what's coming. Well, not only that, all the blessings of this life. At this point, Job is saying, yeah, I know. I just don't care. Now, we know, and I need to say this here because I don't want you to walk away with the wrong idea of Job, because we're going to say some negative things here about Job because he's speaking in a negative way here. At the end of all this, Job is speaking, but he's not embracing his ideas. And there's a difference to that, okay? I'll give you a silly example. When Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016, okay, there was a list of people, hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people, that said, if he wins, I'm moving to Canada, or I'm leaving the United States. They said it, but when he won, they didn't embrace it. They never left. They stayed here. I'll give you another example. Have you ever said something in anger and you're like, I hate that person, or this, or that. And you say something and the person that's with you says, man, do you mean that? You're like, no, I don't really mean it, but I say it anyways because I'm mad, right? Well, at a cosmic level, this is what Job is doing, and so it's a lot more painful when we act this way with God, and we do this all the time. We say things, we think things, we act in certain ways that demonstrate to God, hey, I don't care. Yeah, and I know you blessed me. I know you've given me a lot of things, but right now, I wish I was never born. It's like, you hear kids sometimes say this to their parents, and you've heard this before. When a child in anger says to the parent, I hate you. I hate you. Or maybe says something like, why do you bring me into this world? If that's hurtful for a parent, well, it's sinful against God. And so part of what we're trying to learn here is, well, okay, how am I supposed to respond? Well, Psalms 148 kind of teaches that. We talked about that last week. But here he's saying, come forth from the womb and expire. So here comes about death again and all the things that means. Look at verse 12. Why did the knees receive me? Now, there's some controversy as to what this actually means. There's several theories. One is that in the culture in which Job lived in, it was part of the tradition, the practice, when the baby was born, that the father would seat the newborn on his knee. And that would mean that the father himself was taking possession and acknowledging, this is my son. And this is my posterity here. Another one is that the baby would be placed on the knee of the mother. So the mother can then come to feed the child and nurture the child. Another one is that in many cases in this culture, when women were having a baby, there was the midwife and the group of midwives that was there. And the mother that was giving birth would be leaning against the knees of another woman in order to give birth. And so there's those traditions. Those are the three big ones that I've come across. And so to not really, we don't want to get run down just in trying to figure that out. The way that I try to figure this out is by looking at the next phrase here. In this verse, and it says, and why the breast that I should suck. So it could be that it's coming upon the knee of the mother, or it could be making a juxtaposition there of sorts where it's referring to the father in one and then to the mother in the other line. So you got those two lines in the poem there. We're not going to get into the details of the structures because I don't want to. I can't go into all of that right now, but. Either way, the meaning of that seems to be, why did I get nurtured? Now, I was in Florida for a week not too long ago, and we just got back. I think it was a week ago. We just got back or something. And my sister-in-law has just had her baby, and I don't have her permission to tell this story, but I hope she doesn't get mad at me. But one thing that I noticed was how often, the baby's only 6 months old now, I believe, and how often she had to stop what she was doing to take care of the child, to nurture the child, to feed the child. We were at a bowling alley at one point, and at a bowling alley, you're having fun. And it was someone's birthday, and so we were there, and she had to be there because, this was an important person to her, obviously. And but in the middle of bowling, she can complete her sets. Why? She had to take care of the little one. I don't know what that experience is like. I've never had children, so I've never had to be fatherly or anything like that in that sense. But it's obvious that there's a responsibility that takes place when there's a child. And what Job is saying here, he says, well, why did you receive me? It's almost like he's saying to his mother and father, like, well, why did you bother? You can imagine that child now growing up and they're, 30s or 40s and they're going through some suffering and now they go to mom and dad and say, why did you even feed me? Oh, you should just let me to die. Again, that's not even appreciating the staying up late, the sacrifice that it is for a mother to nurse her child and to stay up at night and to consistently and constantly be there. And in today's day and age, where a lot of mothers, feel that they still have to bring some sort of income into the home because, the economy is falling apart and they're trying to work and do a million other things, but also take care. There's a lot of moving parts there. And for Job now to get to a point where that doesn't even matter. So you see the desperation in Job's words here. He's a desperate man trying to find an answer to his problem, to his trouble. He doesn't want to see it anymore. He's in so much agony. He's in so much pain. He doesn't want to see it. Verse 10, hide trouble from my eyes. I want to see it. I don't want to deal with it. Have you ever been there? Where you just want to deal with it? Where you just want to hide? Where you just want to just expire? We're not talking about suicide here. See, this is different. Some people have read this and they think that Job is contemplating suicide. Suicide is something completely different. Serious. A very terrifying situation for the person that's going through it. But that's not what's happening here. This is an if only this hadn't happened. But the implications of that are a carelessness, a blindness to what God has done, to how God has used the mother, the father to bring this child up. Think about that. He's mad that God found a way to sustain him when he couldn't do nothing for himself. God's way of sustaining a 6-month-old, a 2-month-old, or a 1-year-old is to put it in the heart of the mother to feed that child, to nurture that child. We see the mom doing it, but God is giving the impulse, what we would call the instinct. God is giving that. God is doing the work. And so in all of this, as we're looking at it, we just see Job in a constant state of just not appreciating these wonderful gifts that we are given. And the problem is for the modern man, it doesn't take losing 10 children and all your riches and your status and your wife essentially. It takes like someone cutting you off in traffic. It takes a bad day at work, one bad email or a bad phone call, and all of a sudden you're off into your whole existence just sucks. Really? How about you take a moment to appreciate what God has done? And I think that's part of the application here to our own lives. Is taking that moment to understand and remember what God has done. Well, we have now verse 13 here. There's a bit of a transition here in verse 13 where it's almost strange to me. These next few verses, they kind of start shifting a little bit, and it gets interesting. And at first, if you read this, and you ponder it, at first you're like, well, why is he saying this in particular? And before I say this, I probably should have said this in the beginning, but let me say this. Remember that last week in the first 10 verses, we talk about a curse wish that Job was doing. By the time we get to verse 11, he's transitioned into what's called a lament. He's lamenting now. But the problem with a lament in the Old Testament and in Job's culture, a lament was meant to ask God, in this case, for reprieve of something. Hey, look what I'm going through. Can you do this for me? Okay? This is what's happening. Can you do this? But in Job's lament, that's not really happening. What's happening is, I just want to die. That is my desire. My request is, why didn't you kill me when I was a baby? Why don't you kill me now? And this is what he's going into. So it is a lament. It's a style of a lament. But he's not appreciating anything. At least the person that laments and says, hey, I'm going through a lot here. Can you help me out? They're showing an appreciation for this life. They're saying, yes, I'm suffering, but it's still worth living this life. And Job's like, yeah, I mean, all of that is true, but I still would rather die. And I think we have to be careful to not think that that's something we never do. Because when we think about this, we think about suicide. And you might say to yourself, well, I've never thought about committing suicide. That's not the point. The point is a deep yearning that the life you have simply didn't exist. And there's different ways of us coming to that conclusion. One way, for example, is what I say, and I've heard this said before, is wishing your days away. Right? There's something that's gonna happen 6 months from now, 3 months from now, a concert or something, whatever it might be, and it's in the future, and you say something like, I wish it was that day already. When you say that, I wish that this and this already happened, you're wishing away your existence of those next 3 or 6 months for you to get to where you want to be. You're not paying attention in any way whatsoever to all the blessings that God brings daily into your life, to all the interactions that you're going to have with loved ones, to all the good food even that you're going to enjoy, let's say, all the good moments. You want to surpass all that because you want to get to this thing here. That's one way that we do what Job is doing here. And so I don't want you to think, well, Job is just doing his own thing. He wants to commit suicide. No. This is a very human thing. And we want to pay attention. So look at verse 13 with me, because there's now a plea for rest here. Yes, rest. Look what he says. For now I would have lain down and been quiet. Now, the term there, laying down and being quiet, okay, or to lay down, to be quiet, is a reference to death, to dying, okay? And in the Old Testament language, it would be a reference to Sheol, okay, to the grave. Another way you can maybe think about it is to the place of the dead, okay? To the abode of the dead. It's one way that we can think about it. So he says, for now I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept then. I would have been at rest. Okay, now when you think about this carefully, if he's saying, I wish I was at rest, what does that imply? That he feels restless. But isn't that confusing? What is he restless about? Think about that for a minute. What is he restless about? When you're restless, it's because you have the expectation of something, right? You're waiting for your paycheck to come in. You're restless about that. You're like, man, I need to pay the rent, and this needs to happen. Or you're restless because family's coming in from out of town, and you got all these things you need to do, and you're restless about that. Well, Job had lost his status. That was gone. That wasn't going to come back. Okay, he's up on a hill, on a dunghill. Okay, a landfill essentially, on top of an ash heap. It's called an ash heap there in the Bible, and he's in the worst place that you can be. He's not gonna have his status anymore. He can kiss that goodbye. His wife told him, curse God and die. Presumably, she's gone off and gone about her life. His children are dead. They're never coming back. And his possessions have either been stolen, okay, and they were the animals, or killed. You're not going to get those back either. What are you restless about? There's nothing to be restless about at this point. In the term that we use, rest. There's nothing there. There's nothing for you to work towards. There's just nothing. There's the way that I need to slow down here so I can explain this better. But the way that chapter 1 and chapter 2 describe the lostness of Job, it's absolute. There's no way back. Okay? There's no turning around. There's no changing it. It's clear by the time we get to the end of chapter 2 that they're sitting there, him with his friends, for 7 days. They all know this. It's an unspoken truth at this point. This guy is done. And they look at him as if he were dead. Remember, we talked about this. It's over. So why is he restless? Why is rest the thing that he desires? And I think that the problem here is that Job is now living a reality that he may have known existed, but had never felt it in his own flesh and bone. It had never hit so close to him. And the restlessness, I think, rests in the why question. He's restless to figure out, why is this happening? He's restless to figure out, why can't it just be over? Why does the pain persist? Do you ever wonder about that? You ever wonder why when something hurts, a death, a loss in your family, why does it keep hurting? Why does it keep lingering? It doesn't stop. Life keeps moving, but it's like this thing is just there constantly. It doesn't go away. Even when you're in your most happiest moment, you're smiling, it just comes back and says, I'm still here. There's something on the surface of the earth that is real to all human beings. We all get there at different times in our life. And it's that no matter what, suffering is part of existing. And this is what Job is now recognizing. And look how he phrases this out, okay? Look at verse 14, when he says, with kings and with counselors of the earth. Now, this is interesting language here, and I'm going to probably go back and forth here, guys, a little bit, so just work with me here. I would have slept, verse 13, then I would have been at rest. Verse 14, with kings and with counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves. Who is he talking about here? Well, all of a sudden, Job is now transitioning. Again, in verse 13, he transitions. And now in verse 14 again, he transitions to talk about the societal structure. And that's a little mind-boggling. Well, why are you talking about that now? And he is starting to now make he's starting to now phrase the world, or frame the world, I should say, not phrase the world, but frame the world in a particular way in order to make sense of how the world is. And once he understands that, he gets it. And what you're going to understand, if we can cover that today here, is that when you understand what Job is understanding, you're going to understand why trying to fix it is a bad thing. Okay, so look at this here. He says, with kings and with counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, look at verse 14, or with princes who had gold, who were filling their houses with silver. Okay, so he's talking about the elite class here in society, the leaders, the kings, the presidents, okay, the counselors of the world. What are the counselors of the world? Think about maybe, modern day Elon Musk, Bill Gates, people who are influential, that people go to for counsel. You see them involved in things that you would scratch your head and be like, well, why are you involved in that? You're like a computer guy, but yet they're there. And there's policies that are being created and all of these things. And so you have these leaders, these world leaders, and he's talking about death here. He's talking about Sheol here, the place of the dead. And he says, in the place of the dead, what he's saying is there's kings and with councils of the earth. I would be among them. Does he wish to be among them? No, that's not what he's saying. Because he's not speaking highly of them. Look what he says. He says, who rebuilt ruins for themselves. These kings and these councils of the earth, they're building in places that have already been destroyed. Think of the New Testament for a moment. Where it says there in the Gospels, it talks about, do not build for yourself treasures here on earth, where things can get corrupted, but build your treasure in heaven. He's looking and he's saying, wow, in death, I'll be in the same place as all these guys who all they lived their lives for was to build things in a place that it was never going to work anyways. Whatever castle a king built 2,000 years ago doesn't exist today. Doesn't have the same splendor, even if it's standing. But more than likely, it's in ruins. And then we'll build something on top of that. Think about it. Why would you build there? Why would you build where there's a building that's been dilapidated and falling apart? You don't think yours will eventually get there too? Well, the point is, and the place of the dead is filled with these kinds of people. It's not that I want to be with them, but look how he says. He says, who rebuilt ruins. It's all in the past. Or with princes who had gold, who were filling the houses with silver. Well, what does that mean? They had gold, they had silver, and that's how they counted their wealth. How did Job count his wealth? Livestock. Servants, not gold, not silver. Why is there a distinction there? Well, because Job, if you look at chapter 20, now I gotta go based off my head here. Chapter 29. Look at verse 12. Okay, actually, look at verse 7 first. In chapter 29 of Job. This is who Job was. This is him giving a description of who he was before he was on an ash heap and sick like he is now. He says, when I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the square, so he goes out on the gate of the city, he sits in the square, the young men saw me and hid themselves. They revered him. They were like, oh, there's Job. You can't just approach Job. It's an important man. Okay, and they hid, and we're going to look at this, obviously, when we get there a little bit more deeply, but it says, the young men hid themselves, and the old men arose and stood. Okay, so the hiding is, think about, you're just putting your head down and being reverent in that moment. The old men are arising and they're standing there. They're recognizing who Job is. The princes stopped talking. The princes stopped talking and put their hands on their mouth. Like, here's Job. Job is saying, I was important. I was a man of stature. And he says in verse 10, the voice of the nobles was hushed and the tongue stuck to their palate. For when the ear heard, it called me blessed. And when the eye saw, it gave witness of me. And look how he lived his life. He says, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. It was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. Job uses riches to serve his community. So now, when he finally is on the other side, where he's in need, but all he has is these friends that sit there in silence, and when they speak, they're going to be sorry comforters to him. He gets a taste of that world. And so he says, I didn't live my life like those rich rulers where they rebuilt ruins for themselves, thinking they had something they were going to keep forever, or with those young princes who had gold and they put silver, but they just put it in their house. They weren't putting it in someone else's house. They were putting it in their own house. They were hoarding it for themselves. I live differently than they. But man, when we die, we're all in the same place. So listen what he's saying here. He says in verse 16 now, he jumps to what seems almost to something different. He says, or like a miscarriage which is discarded, I would not be as infants that never saw light. We're going to get back to this in just a second here. Look at verse 17. There the wicked cease from raging, and there the weary are at rest. This is where Job makes a distinction. He makes a distinction that in the place of death, there's two kinds of people. There's the wicked and there's the weary. There's the oppressor and there's the oppressed. And recognize Job. He sees himself as the oppressed. The man who had it all, who had the riches, blameless and righteous before God. And here he is in the place of the dead, and he says, I'm with the weary. He gets it. He gets that place of weariness. So what's going on here? Well, Job, as he now looks at society and looks at the very world in which he lives, he recognizes there's oppressors and there's the oppressed. And that's what exists on the surface of the earth. Because the Sheol is under the earth, okay? It is the place down deep. Now, do you hear heaven in any of this? No. Because he forgot about it. Because he's speaking as if death is the end of it all. But death is not the end of it all. So here we have Job. In verse 16, go back up to verse 16 now. He says, or like a miscarriage which is discarded, I would be. Why does he say that? I spent a lot of hours looking at that verse. And it wasn't until today that I think I figured out what this means. I think what he's trying to say here, where he says, as infants that never saw light, if he is making a distinction between the oppressor and the oppressed, and we know that he lived richly, but he wasn't an oppressor, then he says, I would be like the infant that's miscarried, that's stillborn. Why does he say that? Because the stillborn baby is neither oppressor nor oppressed. They never live. A stillborn baby, in many cases, doesn't even get a name. Doesn't get a birth certificate. The stillborn baby just never was. He was, but he never was. He was never oppressed. He was never an oppressor. And so I think Job sees himself in some ways in this light, or at least saw himself in that light in that previous life. But now he sees himself as one that is weary. There's also a language here that talks about the hiddenness of the miscarriage, meaning that there is something about a stillborn baby that is frightful, because when a baby is born, there's supposed to be a cry, a noise, movement, life. You expect life, and when you expect life, you see death. It's not normal. That doesn't compute. There's something hidden in that. And I think here is where we start getting into talking back about the lament of Job, the underlying theme or kind of feeling, if you want to think of it this way, is that Job he's protesting something. And you should know a little thing or two about protests. We see them all over the place, especially in the last few years. Right? There's this feeling of people want to protest things just to protest them. Because they stand for this, or they don't know what they stand for, but they don't like it. I'm going to protest. Well, Job is protesting here. Job is saying, there's so much suffering on the surface of the earth that it's better to live in Sheol, in the grave. That's how upset he is. That's how much pain he is in. And so what we find here now, going to verse 17 again, there the wicked cease from raging. Well, Job never read chapter 1 of Romans, but we have. And what does that remind us of? What does the word raging here mean? Well, raging here has a double meaning, if you want to think about it this way. It means to ravage. In the physical, actually, what's funny, the physical meaning or definition of rage in the Hebrew is earthquake. Okay, but we're talking more about the emotional side, and it's to bring about just sudden change, surprisingly catastrophic, just this rage that comes. Okay, no real sense behind it. But the second meaning to it, or the double meaning, so it means this at the same time, it's that it is a rage that's a rage within itself, but it also has victims. It hurts others. And again, this is where we see the oppressed versus oppressor that Job is talking about. And look at chapter 1 of the book of Romans. It's almost like he was reading this. Look at verse 22, okay, of chapter 1 of Romans, where it says, professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to degrading passions, for the women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. So they're raging. They're going against the very natural order of things. Raging. And this continues all the way to look at verse 32. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Well, as society is crumbling apart, those that are not the oppressor become the oppressed. And if you don't think that's true, then you have to pay attention. You might look at your life and say, I'm not really oppressed. I'm good. I go to work. I do what I do. But there's an oppressor out there. My mom once told me when I was young, it was time ready to move on with my life and kind of leave home. And she's like, I'm going to tell you something. And she didn't say it in such a nice way, but she says to me, just so you know, there's always going to be someone to boss you around. I didn't get that when she first told me that, but I've understood it over the years to mean that we live in a world where there's always someone telling you what to do. You can't just do whatever it is you want to do, which is interesting because what we learn in the New Testament is the language of slave and master. We become slaves to Christ. That's what happens. And so what we got happening here in Job chapter 3, verse 17, is this realization that at death, it's not that we're all equal. See, everybody thinks that death is the great equalizer. It's not. It's the great disabler. In death, Job sees the oppressor still there and the oppressed there, but what's happening is there's no more trouble. Trouble has been disabled. So he describes death as a restful, peaceful place, which at the same time that he describes Sheol in that way, he now points to the earth and says, that's a place of trouble. Now, okay, my clock, that was weird. Okay, I think someone's being merciful with me on my time because I have a few more minutes left. But I'm going to try to wrap up here, guys. Look at verse 18. The prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. Here, the word prisoner here is not referring to someone in jail like you and I would normally think. It's thinking of prisoner of war. Okay, and what would happen, in Old Testament times, and even the Romans would do this. In the New Testament, we see this, where you take captive, those that you've just destroyed. You take men and women captive, and you put them to work for you. Okay, that's what it's talking about here. So it says the prisoners are at ease together. And the word ease there is really a reference to an ease of the fear that the prisoner of war has. Because why? Well, in the bottom of the second half of verse 18 explains it. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. There's no taskmaster. There's still the taskmaster that's there, but his voice is mute because he's dead. They're all dead. And that's the point. And we do this in life, don't we? I mean, just think about this. Think about the kind of funeral that, a homeless man that dies in the corner gets and a funeral that a president gets, or a statesman gets, or someone who has money gets. Pretty different, right? And when we were at the cemetery, you could see the difference there. You could tell the people that are well off. You're like, oh yeah, look, Jimmy Lee over there. Look at that big old mausoleum thing he has, and still, neatly trimmed and flowers and beautiful. And yeah, they got money. And poor little guy over here only has, don't even have a stone yet because they can't afford it. And that guy was obviously, that guy's poor. And he's poor, he's rich. They're both still what they are, but they're dead. And that's the point that he's bringing forth here. And he's saying that is better than all the trouble here in the world. And while he does that, he ignores completely heaven. See, when you have your eyes set on the things of the world, when you walk by sight and not by faith, you forget about heaven. And when you forget about heaven, you forget to trust in the Lord. And we have to trust in the Lord. He says in verse 19, the small and the great are there. They're there. I guess I see them. Look, they're dead. They're both there. And the slave is free from his master. See, it's not the gray, people talk today about the quality of outcome. That is the world's biggest lie right now. Because what Job teaches us here, even though he's out of step in a way by saying all that he's saying, because he's not recognizing heaven and the good things that God has given him. Well, what he's saying is, you can't fix this. This is a fallen world. It can't be fixed. See, the Christian is not called to fix the world. We're called to preach the gospel. We're called to tell people they're suffering in the world. But they're suffering because we live in a fallen world. A world that does not recognize God. And I mean that in the full term of recognition. That does not believe. Hey, I'll tell you this, and I'll finish with this. The atheist and the unbeliever thinks that everything ends at death. And to them, that is the assurance of condemnation. Here's what I mean. They know they're condemned. They know they're condemned. They know they're condemned. They may stop at death and say, hey, that's where we're all condemned to. That's where it ends. We're all condemned to death. But they don't realize that after the condemnation comes the torment of the wrath of God. That's on this side. On the other side, you've got the believer who recognizes heaven and the hope of heaven and the reality of hell. And the hope of heaven brings them to a place of assurance of salvation. These are the two big divides. You got the oppressor, you got the oppressed. I'll go a bit beyond that, and I'll say you have the elect and you have the reprobate. We don't know who's who often. It's hard to tell. You don't know if you're an oppressor or an oppressed. You might be both. Often people are. But what you can decide today is to look at Christ and see in Christ the God who came down to the world of trouble, the world that Job says, I'd rather live under it than on it. And he comes to live, Christ does, on this world, on this earth, to live this life as a man and suffer upon a cross to die for the sins of those that are his. And it is my job to tell you, to proclaim to you that if you believe in Jesus Christ and you repent from your sin, you will be saved. And what I would ask is for you to come to Christ. But when you do, and now I speak to you who may come to Christ and to those that are in Christ, and I would say, remind yourself daily that you're in Christ, so that you don't speak foolishly and forget heaven and forget what God does day to day to bless you. Father, we thank you for this time. Thank you for your word. Thank you for those that are listening live and those that will listen later. We pray that your word is effective, Lord, and changes lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.